They woke up early in the morning to a strange rumble, as if the ground beneath their house was breathing Dot. When they stepped outside, they saw a massive sinkhole filled with water right in the middle of their yard, Dot. But that wasn't the scariest part. The specialists who arrived soon ordered the entire town to be evacuated, Dot. What was hidden beneath that sinkhole was something no one ever expected to see. Dot, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The late afternoon sun drifted lazily over the quiet southern neighborhood, tinting the rooftops with a copper hue. The heat of the day was finally softening, and the faint hum of cicadas filled the still air. In the Johnsons' backyard, the faint aroma of wet grass mingled with the scent of jasmine, a flower that Evelyn cherished and tended with almost sacred devotion. The small house where she and Marcus had lived for nearly 2 decades sat at the end of a narrow street, surrounded by old pecan trees and framed by a white picket fence that had long lost its shine but none of its charm. It wasn't a big home, nor a modern one, but every corner carried the weight of years, of effort, of love carefully stitched into its walls. Marcus sat by the back steps, a pair of pliers in one hand, tightening the loose wire of the fence. His shirt clung to his back from the humidity, but he worked slowly and methodically, as he always did. He was a man who didn't rush things. Every bolt, every nail had to be just right. The kind of person who believed the world could still be fixed with his own 2 hands. Evelyn, meanwhile, knelt beside her flower bed, trimming the overgrown stems of her mint plants, her fingers damp from the soil. She liked the feel of the earth. It grounded her, soothed her mind after long days at the library where she worked part-time. Together, they made a portrait of quiet perseverance. 2 people who had built a life not through luck, but through quiet, steady work. The sun slipped lower, and the shadows stretched across the yard. Marcus finished his repair, leaned back, and admired the fence. It wasn't perfect, but it stood strong. He wiped his forehead and looked toward Evelyn, who was humming softly under her breath. The tune was something old, one she used to sing to their daughter years ago, before she moved away to Atlanta for college. Now the melody carried a faint melancholy, a whisper of time passing too fast. The ground beneath them was still and solid, or so it seemed. Nothing in that tranquil evening gave any warning of what would come. The cicadas droned, the jasmine swayed, and the faint rumble of a passing truck rolled down the street, its vibrations barely perceptible. Evelyn noticed a tremor in the soil by her plants, a soft vibration that lasted only a second, so faint that she thought she imagined it. She paused, brushed the dirt from her palms, and glanced toward Marcus. He didn't seem to notice anything, so she said nothing. Perhaps it was just the truck again, or maybe the ground settling after the rain 2 nights ago. Rain was always a concern here. The city's drainage wasn't great, and their yard sat on a slight incline. Whenever it poured, water pooled in the far corner near the old shed before trickling away toward the storm drain by the fence. Marcus had fixed it once years ago by digging a trench, but over time the soil had shifted and filled it in again. Evelyn had mentioned it a few times. We should redo the trench, she said, but life had a way of burying small tasks under bigger ones. The neighbor's dog barked suddenly, snapping at something unseen by the old oak tree. Its leash rattled, and then the barking stopped as quickly as it began. Marcus looked up, frowning slightly, then shrugged. The neighborhood dogs barked at anything: raccoons, shadows, even the wind. But tonight, the silence that followed was heavier than usual. He didn't notice it consciously, not yet, but the air seemed thicker, as if it were holding its breath. Evelyn stood and brushed the dirt from her knees. "Let's go in," she said, smiling faintly. Marcus nodded. They closed the back door, locked it, and switched on the kitchen light. The house filled with a warm glow, soft and golden. The old ceiling fan groaned faintly as it turned, pushing the air around in lazy circles. Evelyn poured sweet tea into 2 glasses, and they sat down by the small kitchen table. Their conversation was ordinary, about the weather, the grocery list, a letter from their daughter promising a visit in the fall. Marcus mentioned he might fix the shed roof next weekend, if it didn't rain. Evelyn told him she'd been sorting through some old newspapers at the library and found an article about the underground storage tanks built during the war. She said it lightly, amused by how sensational those old headlines were. "They said people used to hide all sorts of things back then," she chuckled. Marcus smiled and didn't think much of it. To him, history was history, distant, sealed away under layers of dust and time. The night came quietly, a humid blanket settling over the neighborhood. Crickets replaced the cicadas, and the sky turned a deep indigo, punctuated by slow-moving clouds. Marcus went to the shed to put away his tools. Inside, the air smelled faintly of rust and damp wood. A few nails gleamed under the light of his flashlight, and water stains marked the edges of the floorboards. He frowned, pressing his boot against one of the planks. It felt slightly soft. "Must be the humidity," he murmured. He would check it properly tomorrow. When he returned to the house, Evelyn was already tidying up the kitchen. They went through their nightly rituals, locking windows, turning off lights, setting the alarm clock by the bed. Marcus read a few pages of an old repair manual, more out of habit than interest, while Evelyn flipped through a gardening magazine. By 11, the house was dark except for the faint blue glow of the digital clock. Outside, clouds began to gather again, though no storm had been forecasted. A fine mist drifted in from the west, just enough to wet the leaves. It wasn't a real rain, just the kind that whispers rather than falls. The water trickled slowly along the uneven ground, following paths it had carved long ago. Beneath the soil, unseen, it seeped into narrow gaps between layers of clay and gravel, finding spaces that had lain undisturbed for decades. In the middle of the night, Evelyn stirred in her sleep. A low vibration shivered through the house, too soft to wake her fully. The sound might have been distant thunder, or something beneath the earth shifting ever so slightly. A picture frame tilted on the dresser, its nail loosening just a fraction of an inch. The vibration faded, leaving silence in its wake. Morning arrived bright and calm, the sky scrubbed clean and blue. The first thing Evelyn noticed when she stepped outside was how fresh the air felt after the night's mist. The ground was soft underfoot, but she paid it little mind. Marcus joined her with a mug of coffee, watching the sunlight play across the yard. Everything looked peaceful, almost perfect. And yet, as she bent to touch one of her mint plants, Evelyn noticed something unusual. A narrow line of moisture ran diagonally across the yard, a thin silver vein glinting in the light. It led away from the garden bed toward the far edge of the lawn, right where the soil dipped near the old shed. It wasn't much, just a trickle of water that disappeared into the earth, but something about it made her uneasy. Marcus followed her gaze. "It's just the runoff," he said after a moment. "We'll have to fix that trench again before the next rain." Evelyn nodded, though her eyes lingered on the damp patch a little longer. She thought she heard a faint hollow sound when the wind passed over that spot, but she convinced herself it was her imagination. The day unfolded like any other. Marcus went to work at the repair shop across town, and Evelyn spent her morning at the library, sorting returned books and chatting with co-workers. When she came home in the afternoon, the yard looked the same as always, though the patch of damp soil had widened slightly. She frowned, but didn't say anything. There was dinner to make, laundry to fold, and the hum of normal life to drown out small worries. As dusk fell once again, the neighborhood bathed in amber light. Children's laughter echoed faintly from the next street, and someone grilled dinner, the scent of smoke drifting on the breeze. Marcus sat on the porch, oiling his old toolbox, while Evelyn watered her plants one last time. When she reached the far end of the yard, she paused again by that same patch of ground. For a fleeting moment, she thought she heard something beneath it, a soft, deep resonance, as if the earth itself were exhaling. She set the watering can down and crouched, pressing her palm against the soil. It felt cool and damp, almost too damp. She stayed that way for a moment, her heart beating a little faster, and then stood abruptly. "I'll tell Marcus tomorrow," she thought. "He'll think I'm just worrying over nothing." That night, the air grew heavy again. The crickets fell silent earlier than usual, and a strange stillness settled over the block. The clouds drifted low, veiling the moon, and the faint smell of ozone hung in the air. Inside, the Johnsons slept soundly, unaware of what was stirring beneath their home. Sometime after midnight, a faint crack echoed from the backyard. It was soft, like wood splintering under slow pressure. Then came another, followed by a distant gurgling sound, low and wet, as if water were moving where it shouldn't. The sound lasted no more than a few seconds, but in those seconds, the ground behind the Johnsons' house shifted ever so slightly. The soil sank by less than an inch, just enough for the fence to lean forward almost imperceptibly. By dawn, the first birds began to sing again, and the air carried the sweetness of wet earth. From her window, Evelyn could not see the change. The lawn looked as serene as ever, the sunlight painting golden patches across the grass, but deep beneath the surface the soil was hollowing out, a slow, unseen hunger widening below. The ground was breathing differently now, almost as if it were alive. It would be only a matter of hours before the earth finally gave way. For now, the house stood quiet, framed by jasmine and morning light, resting above a secret that had begun to wake. When Evelyn awoke the next morning, the house was filled with an odd, heavy silence. The kind that comes just before a storm or right after something breaks. She could not say why it felt different. The air itself seemed still, the walls somehow thinner, as if listening. The clock ticked on the nightstand, louder than usual. Marcus was already up. She heard him in the kitchen, his voice low, muttering something to himself as the kettle hissed. Outside, a faint metallic smell drifted in through the half-open window, like rainwater on rusted iron, though the sky was bright and cloudless. She slipped into her robe and walked toward the back door. The moment she stepped outside, her breath caught in her throat. The backyard, her green, peaceful, familiar backyard, was no longer the same. The far end of the lawn had collapsed into a massive hole, raw and dark, its edges jagged and uneven. The grass that had once been smooth and soft now hung in torn layers, roots exposed, clinging to nothing. A thin mist hovered above the hole, rising from the damp, earthy depths, and at the bottom shimmered water, still and opaque, reflecting the pale morning light like glass. For a long time, Evelyn did not move. Her mind refused to understand what her eyes were showing her. It was as if the earth had been swallowed, as if someone had peeled away a piece of the world and left only emptiness. Then she called for Marcus, her voice trembling. He came running out, still holding his coffee mug, and froze beside her. Neither of them spoke. The sight was too strange, too unreal. "What in God's name?" he whispered at last. The mug slipped from his hand and shattered against the steps. The sound startled them both. They approached cautiously, stopping several feet away from the edge. The soil there looked loose, unstable, a crumbly mixture of clay and sand. Marcus crouched and picked up a stone, tossing it gently into the pit. It fell with a hollow splash, and ripples spread across the surface of the murky water. It seemed deeper than it should be. He glanced back at Evelyn, his expression a mixture of disbelief and concern. "It must have opened during the night," he said. "Maybe the ground just gave way." Evelyn's heart was pounding. "But how? Yesterday everything was fine. I was just here, watering the plants." He looked at the hole again. "Could be a burst pipe, or the rain soaking in. You know how soft this soil is." Yet, even as he said it, he knew the explanation was too simple. The pit was too wide, too symmetrical, and too deep to be just water erosion. Something underneath had collapsed, something old. The neighbor's dog began barking furiously again, pulling at its leash, eyes fixed toward the hole. A few minutes later, the man from next door, Mr. Barrett, appeared, holding his own coffee cup. "You folks seeing this?" he called over the fence. When he caught sight of the hole, his face went pale. "Jesus, that wasn't there yesterday." By noon, half the block had gathered by the fence, murmuring in disbelief. Phones were out, pictures were taken, and someone had already posted a video online. Marcus could hear snippets of conversation. Sinkhole, gas line, collapse. Words that carried a mixture of fear and fascination. He didn't like the way the ground felt under his feet. Every few minutes he could feel a faint vibration, a subtle shift beneath the soles of his boots, as if the earth itself were breathing. Evelyn stood beside him, her hands clasped tightly together. "We should call the city," she said. He nodded. Within an hour, 2 men in orange vests arrived, followed by a police cruiser and a small crowd of onlookers. The men examined the hole, took measurements, muttered technical phrases Marcus couldn't follow. One of them radioed for additional support. The other advised everyone to stay back. The sound of a helicopter came later that afternoon, circling above for several minutes before drifting away. Reporters began arriving, first local, then regional. Cameras glinted in the sun. Evelyn felt exposed, as though their quiet life had been stripped bare. People were pointing at their yard, discussing it as though it were a scene from a disaster movie, not the place where she had planted jasmine and mint. By evening, the city had set up temporary fencing around the property. A man in a hard hat approached Marcus and explained that the hole appeared to be growing. "It's expanding laterally," he said. "Could be unstable ground underneath. We need to run ground-penetrating radar scans." "How big could it get?" Marcus asked. The man's expression was grave. "Hard to say. If it's a sinkhole caused by a void underground, it could widen until it hits stable rock, or stop tomorrow. We can't be sure." That night, as dusk settled, the hole seemed larger. Marcus could see where the soil had crumbled further inward. The fence posts on the far side leaned precariously, half suspended in air. The pool of water below glimmered faintly, as if reflecting light from somewhere deep beneath the surface. Evelyn couldn't bring herself to look at it for long. Every time she did, she felt dizzy, as if it were pulling her in. When darkness fell, the flashing lights of emergency vehicles painted the house in alternating red and blue. City officials went door to door, advising residents to be cautious. The Johnsons were told to pack a few essentials in case they needed to leave for the night. Evelyn stood in their bedroom, folding clothes mechanically. The air smelled faintly of damp plaster. Each creak of the floorboards made her flinch. Marcus tried to reassure her. "It's precautionary," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. "They just need to check what's underneath." She nodded, but her eyes were drawn again and again to the window. From there, she could see the faint outline of the hole in the moonlight, a black wound in the earth. It looked deeper now. Somewhere inside her, something whispered that this was only the beginning. Around midnight, the first tremor came. A deep rumble shook the walls, not sharp or violent, but slow, like the groan of something ancient shifting in its sleep. Evelyn sat up in bed, clutching the blanket. Marcus was already on his feet, reaching for the flashlight. The sound faded after a few seconds, replaced by the distant barking of dogs up and down the street. Then silence again. At dawn, the inspectors returned with their equipment. They drove metal stakes into the ground, lowered sensors, and took readings. Marcus watched them work from the porch, arms crossed. The foreman, a middle-aged man with weathered skin, finally approached him. "There's subsidence," he said quietly. "The ground's moving, slow but steady. We'll need to evacuate the immediate area while we figure out the extent." Evelyn came to the door, her face pale. "Evacuate?" "Just temporary, ma'am, until we're sure it's safe." By late morning, a police car blocked the end of the street, and neighbors began loading cars with suitcases and pets. Some complained, others simply obeyed, too frightened to argue. The Johnsons packed what they could: clothes, documents, a few photographs. Marcus stood for a long moment in the doorway before locking it. He felt like he was abandoning something more than just a house. As they drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The yellow tape around their yard fluttered in the wind, and beyond it, the dark circle of the hole gleamed like an unblinking eye. He wondered how deep it went and what lay beneath. The evacuation center was set up in a local gymnasium. Cots lined the floor and volunteers handed out coffee and sandwiches. Evelyn sat quietly beside Marcus, watching people talk, their voices low and nervous. She tried to distract herself by reading the pamphlet given to them by the city, but the words blurred together. Geological instability, potential sinkhole expansion, monitoring ongoing. She folded it and set it aside. That evening, the news played on a small television in the corner of the gym. The headline scrolled across the screen: "Mysterious sinkhole forces neighborhood evacuation." A reporter stood outside their home, gesturing toward the gaping void behind the tape. Evelyn couldn't listen. She turned away, covering her face. Marcus reached for her hand, his own trembling slightly. 2 days passed. The hole continued to widen, now more than 20 feet across and 30 feet deep. Engineers pumped water out, but it returned within hours, bubbling up from unseen channels. "There's a cavity system below," one of them said during a press briefing. "Possibly old infrastructure or natural voids." But no one could explain why it had opened so suddenly, or why now. The neighborhood became a restricted zone. Cameras and drones captured every angle. Theories spread online: an underground river, a forgotten mine shaft, even secret tunnels from the war era. Some laughed, others swore it was true. Marcus and Evelyn, displaced and uncertain, watched from afar as their quiet life became a spectacle for the rest of the city. Each night, Evelyn dreamed of falling. In her dreams, she stood at the edge of the pit, and the earth crumbled beneath her feet, drawing her down into a vast, dark space filled with whispering water. She always woke before she hit the bottom. On the fourth day, officials escorted Marcus back briefly to collect a few more belongings. The moment he stepped onto the street, he could smell the damp, mineral scent of the ground. The hole was enormous now, its sides slick with moisture. He stood there, staring into it. At the bottom, something caught the light, a faint metallic glint half buried in mud. He blinked, thinking it might be debris, but the shape looked deliberate, curved like part of a structure. Before he could look closer, one of the workers called him back. "Stay clear of the edge, sir. It's unstable." He obeyed, but the image stayed in his mind. That night, back at the shelter, he told Evelyn what he'd seen. It looked like metal, he said, not pipe metal, more like a wall or a lid. Evelyn frowned. "A lid? To what?" "I don't know. But whatever's down there, it's not just soil and water." Outside, rain began to fall again. Soft at first, then harder. It tapped against the gym windows in steady rhythm. Neither of them slept. Marcus lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the ground beneath their home. It had always been solid, dependable. Now it felt like a living thing, unpredictable, ready to swallow whatever rested on top of it. By dawn, the rain had stopped, but the clouds hung low and heavy. News crews were back at the site, broadcasting live. The hole, they reported, had grown another 2 meters overnight. City officials assured the public that the situation was under control, but their tight expressions betrayed doubt. The Johnsons' street was now a ghost road, fenced and silent, except for the constant hum of generators and pumps. From their place at the shelter window, Evelyn watched the footage on television. The image zoomed in on their backyard, where workers were lowering equipment into the hole. She could see the reflection of the reporter's microphone in the water. Then, just for an instant, a shimmer, something metallic glinting below before the picture cut away. She pressed her hand against her lips, her mind spinning. Their home, their sanctuary, was gone. What had begun as a quiet morning had turned into a spectacle of fear and speculation. But somewhere deep beneath the collapsing earth, something man-made waited, sealed away for nearly a century, and now the ground was remembering. The fracture had begun, and nothing on the surface would ever be the same again. For the next 2 days, the rain returned as though the heavens had decided to mirror the turmoil below. Sheets of water blurred the outlines of the city, pooling along curbs and turning streets into slick ribbons of gray. At the shelter, Marcus and Evelyn sat side by side on cots that groaned with every movement, listening to the monotonous patter against the windows. The place smelled of coffee, disinfectant, and exhaustion. Families whispered in corners, children cried in their sleep, and the low hum of a portable heater filled the empty spaces between conversations. Each night was the same. No news, no answers, just waiting. When the call finally came that morning, it wasn't the one they had hoped for. An official from the city council stood at the front of the gym, reading from a printed notice. The evacuation would be extended indefinitely. Engineers were still unable to determine the full extent of the underground collapse, and more houses were now considered at risk. Some residents would be temporarily relocated to motels on the east side. Others would remain in the shelter until new housing could be arranged. Evelyn listened in stunned silence, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Marcus stared straight ahead, his jaw set as though bracing himself for another blow. Afterward, he went outside for air. The morning was damp and heavy, the sky a dull, unbroken gray. The air carried the metallic scent of wet asphalt. He leaned against the railing, looking down the hill toward the blocked-off neighborhood. From here, he could just make out the tops of the familiar trees lining Cole Road, the street where they had lived for 20 years. The name had always seemed quaint before, a remnant of the area's mining past, but now it felt ominous, prophetic. Beneath that road, the earth was opening, swallowing memories and foundations alike. A man from the Geological Survey approached, clipboard in hand, his orange vest soaked through. "You're Marcus Johnson, right? The property on Cole Road?" Marcus nodded. "I thought you'd want to know. Our team's been mapping the subsidence patterns. It's not just your yard. We've detected voids running beneath several lots in that stretch. We're trying to determine if they're connected." "Void?" Marcus repeated the word as if testing it on his tongue. It sounded clinical, harmless even, and yet it meant absence, hollowness, something gone. "Old infrastructure, maybe," the man said, "possibly tunnels. This part of the city sits over layers of mixed fill. Coal shafts, storm drains, maybe even forgotten storage caverns. We won't know until we stabilize the site." He hesitated before adding, "I'm sorry, I know it's your home, but you should prepare for the possibility it might be condemned." Marcus said nothing. He simply nodded once, curtly, and watched the man walk away. The rain started again, soft at first, then harder, each drop landing with a steady rhythm that seemed to echo inside his chest. When he went back inside, Evelyn was folding blankets into a neat stack, an act of pointless order in a world unraveling. She looked up at him, her face pale. "Did they say anything new?" "Only that it's worse than they thought," he replied quietly. "They think there's a whole network down there." She closed her eyes. "So it's true then. There's something under us." He wanted to tell her not to worry, to promise they'd rebuild, but the words wouldn't come. He sat beside her instead, their shoulders touching, the silence between them heavy but shared. That night, as they lay awake on their cots, the shelter was alive with restless movement. Someone's child was coughing. An old man muttered prayers under his breath. Evelyn turned on her side and looked at Marcus. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling. "Do you ever think about leaving this place?" she asked softly. He frowned. "You mean the city?" She nodded. "Maybe it's a sign. Maybe we're not meant to stay." Marcus hesitated. He had lived his whole life here. Every street, every building carried a piece of his story. To imagine leaving was like cutting off a part of himself, but then he thought of the whole. Black, bottomless, patient, and the way the ground had trembled under his boots. For the first time, he wasn't sure. The following morning, city buses arrived to transfer the evacuees. The Johnsons were among those moved to a small roadside motel, a 2-story building with faded paint and buzzing neon. Their room smelled faintly of mildew and old cigarettes, but at least it had privacy. From the window, Evelyn could see the highway stretching toward the hills. She watched the traffic for a long time, hypnotized by the endless motion. In the evenings, the news ran constant updates. The sinkhole had grown to 30 feet across, 35 deep. Water continued to fill it faster than pumps could drain. Engineers now confirmed the presence of a man-made structure beneath the collapse zone. The footage showed workers standing near the edge, their helmets tiny against the massive void. For a fleeting moment, the camera zoomed in on something metallic glinting below, a curve of steel, half buried in silt. Evelyn felt a chill run through her. "That's what you saw?" she whispered. Marcus nodded slowly. "They're saying it might be a cap, some kind of sealed chamber." As the days passed, the situation worsened. The ground near the Johnsons' property began to crack outward, creating fissures that ran toward neighboring yards. 2 other houses were evacuated as a precaution. People on the news argued about who was responsible: the city, the developers, the long-forgotten mining companies that had dug beneath the land a century ago. But none of it mattered to the Johnsons. Their home, the small world they had built together, was gone. Evelyn walked through the motel parking lot one evening, the sunset bleeding red across the wet pavement. She remembered the scent of jasmine, the sound of the old gate creaking in the breeze. The loss hit her in waves. First disbelief, then grief, then anger. She wanted to dig her hands into the dirt of her garden, to feel the soil that had betrayed her, to ask it why. But the only thing left to hold was air. One afternoon, a city official visited them at the motel. He was polite, even kind, but his words carried the weight of bureaucracy. The property was being reassessed for safety. It might be weeks before they were allowed back. "We're doing everything possible to stabilize the site," he said, "but your safety comes first." Evelyn forced a smile. Of course, safety. After he left, Marcus stood by the window, watching the headlights pass on the wet road. "They don't know what they're dealing with," he said quietly. "That's not just soil collapse. Something's under there, and they're afraid to admit it." Evelyn came up behind him, resting her chin on his shoulder. "You think it's dangerous?" He exhaled. "I think it's old, and anything that's been buried that long, maybe it should have stayed that way." Days turned into weeks. The motel became their temporary home. Evelyn filled the silence with small routines, brewing coffee in the room's single-cup machine, arranging her books on the dresser, keeping things neat to feel in control. Marcus spent his days at the evacuation center, volunteering to help other residents. He needed to stay busy. Idleness made him restless, made him think about what lay beneath. Then, one morning, the phone rang. It was the city office. They were allowing limited supervised visits for residents to collect remaining belongings, only 10 minutes per household. Marcus and Evelyn were given an appointment for the following afternoon. When they returned to Cole Road, the sight was surreal. The once bustling neighborhood was eerily quiet. Police barricades lined the street, and heavy machinery stood idle beside enormous mounds of dirt. The Johnsons' house was still standing, but the yard around it was unrecognizable. The grass was gone, replaced by a broad circle of churned mud and gravel. The hole itself had grown into a small pond, surrounded by steel fencing and floodlights. Water glimmered inside it, dark and opaque, like a mirror turned toward the underworld. Evelyn pressed a hand to her chest. "It looks like it's swallowing everything." An engineer escorted them to the porch, cautioning them to avoid the rear of the property. Inside, the house smelled of damp wood and dust. The clock on the wall had stopped at 12:47, though neither of them could remember when. They gathered photo albums, heirlooms, small pieces of their life that could fit into a single box. Every creak of the floor made Evelyn jump. As they were leaving, Marcus paused by the kitchen window and looked out toward the hole. The water rippled gently, though the air was still. A faint current seemed to swirl at the center, drawing the surface inward as if something below were breathing. He couldn't explain it, but he felt sure the ground wasn't finished with them yet. Back at the motel, Evelyn unpacked their box of memories on the bed. Old photographs lay scattered across the blanket. Weddings, birthdays, summers long gone. She traced her fingers over one picture of the house before the collapse, sunlight streaming across the garden, everything bright and whole. "We'll never get it back, will we?" she murmured. Marcus didn't answer. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at his hands. "Maybe not," he said finally, "but maybe we're not supposed to." That night, Evelyn dreamed again. She was standing at the edge of the pit, the air heavy with fog. The water below was perfectly still, but she could see her reflection, only it wasn't hers. The face staring back was older, unfamiliar, and behind it, shapes moved in the dark. She woke with a gasp, her heart racing. Marcus was already awake, sitting by the window, the curtain drawn aside. "I couldn't sleep," he said. "It's strange. Sometimes I swear I can feel it, even from here, like the ground humming." She didn't answer. The room was quiet except for the faint ticking of the motel's old wall clock. The world outside went on as usual. Cars, rain, wind. But for the Johnsons, time itself had slowed. They were trapped in an endless waiting, balanced between what had been and what might still come from below. When morning came, the phone rang again. The voice on the other end was calm but urgent. The engineers had made a discovery at the site. They needed Marcus and Evelyn to come in for questioning, not because they were in danger, the official assured them, but because the structure beneath their home appeared to have been deliberately sealed. Evelyn's hand trembled as she hung up the phone. She looked at Marcus, her eyes wide with dread and something else. Curiosity. Whatever lay buried beneath their home, it had been hidden for a reason. And now, after decades of silence, the earth had decided to reveal it. The evacuation, it seemed, was only the beginning. The drive back to Cole Road felt longer than it should have been. The city had set up a perimeter almost a mile from the site, and the Johnsons' car was stopped twice by uniformed officers before they were allowed through. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a gray, glistening landscape that smelled of wet clay and oil. The closer they drew to their neighborhood, the more unfamiliar it appeared. What had once been a row of quiet homes and trimmed lawns now looked like a half-forgotten construction site. The houses were empty, their windows boarded up, and the road itself was scarred with deep cracks filled with stagnant rainwater. Yellow caution tape fluttered in the wind like banners of surrender. As they approached their property, Evelyn felt a chill crawl along her spine. The hole, the sinkhole, as everyone now called it, was larger than before, far larger. What had once been a wound in the earth had become a gaping crater, nearly 50 feet across. The air around it felt cooler, as though it were drawing warmth downward. Workers in hard hats moved carefully around the perimeter, setting up cables and sensors. Massive pumps hummed nearby, the hoses snaking into the depths below. The rhythmic sound of the machinery filled the silence like the breathing of some enormous beast. An engineer named Keating, the same man who had escorted them before, met them at the barrier. He looked exhausted. His safety vest was splattered with mud, and there were dark crescents beneath his eyes. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson," he said, his voice polite but strained. "Thank you for coming. I imagine you've seen the latest reports." Marcus shook his head. "We've seen the headlines, that's all." Keating nodded slowly. "Then you should know we've confirmed something unusual. There's definitely a man-made structure beneath your property. We first assumed it was an old reservoir or storage tank, but the readings don't match. It's too large, too deep, and too deliberately sealed." Evelyn frowned. "Sealed?" "Yes. Whatever it is, someone went to great lengths to bury it. We found reinforced concrete walls, industrial grade, not residential, and there's a metallic plate at the center, like a hatch or door. We're trying to determine its purpose." Marcus looked toward the pit. "You think it's safe to be digging?" Keaton hesitated. "That's what we're here to find out. We have geologists, structural engineers, even a few historians looking into local records. But documentation from the early 1900s is sparse." The couple followed him to the edge, where a temporary walkway had been built from steel scaffolding. The sight that greeted them was both mesmerizing and terrifying. The hole descended like a funnel, its walls lined with streaks of mud and rock. Near the bottom, where water had been pumped out, a dull metallic surface gleamed faintly beneath the muck. Workers were spraying it with hoses, clearing away layers of sediment. The plate was enormous, circular, perhaps 20 feet across, and marked with rivets around its edge. It looked nothing like modern construction, older, heavier, more deliberate. Evelyn gripped the railing, her heart pounding. "It looks like a door," she said softly. Keating nodded. "That's our assumption. We haven't tried to open it yet. There's some concern about what might be inside: air pressure, gases, contamination. We're proceeding carefully." Marcus watched in silence. The scale of it was staggering. He felt small, irrelevant, as if their house, his life, had been built atop a secret too vast to comprehend. For years they had mowed the lawn above this, planted flowers, lived ordinary days without knowing what lay beneath their feet. He turned to Keating. "How deep does it go?" "We don't know yet," Keating said. "The ground-penetrating radar shows chambers or voids extending laterally from the central point. It's not just a single space. There's a network down there." "A network of what?" Evelyn asked. "That's what we're trying to determine." They watched as a worker descended by rope, vanishing into the pit. A moment later, his voice crackled over the radio. "The surface is solid, sir, definitely metal. There's some kind of numbering etched near the rim. Looks like serial codes, or maybe coordinates." Keating scribbled notes on his clipboard, murmuring under his breath. Evelyn leaned closer, straining to hear the faint echo of the man's voice from below. The idea that something human-made, something engineered and hidden, had slept beneath their garden all these years filled her with a strange unease. It wasn't just fear. It was the disquiet of discovering that the familiar world had layers she'd never imagined. By mid-afternoon, the press had gathered outside the restricted zone again. Cameras waited beyond the barricades, reporters eager for any scrap of new information. "The Johnson Sinkhole," one of them had dubbed it, though the couple hated the name. It made their tragedy sound like a tourist attraction. When the Johnsons returned to the command tent, Keating spread a series of old maps across a folding table. "We've been cross-referencing these with the geological data," he explained. "Most of this land was part of a mining district in the late 1800s. There were several shafts, but none recorded directly beneath your property. What's more, these markings," he pointed to faint lines on the map, "suggest some sort of auxiliary construction from the 1940s. Government work, most likely, but the archives are incomplete. It's as if someone deliberately removed the records." Marcus studied the maps, his brow furrowed. "So it could have been military." "It's possible," Keating admitted. "During the war, they built storage facilities and bunkers all across the country. Some were decommissioned and forgotten. If this was one of them, it might have been sealed after the conflict ended." Evelyn looked down at the dark smudge on the map that marked their home. And no one remembered? Keating sighed. Memory fades fast when it's inconvenient. As they spoke, a technician entered the tent, rain dripping from his helmet. "Sir, you'll want to see this. We've picked up an anomaly. Temperature differential inside the cavity. Warmer than expected." "Warmer?" Keating repeated. "Yes, it's about 12 degrees higher than the surrounding soil. Could indicate trapped air or something generating residual heat." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Keating straightened. "We'll continue monitoring. No one goes in until we know what we're dealing with." That evening, the Johnsons returned to the motel. The drive was silent. Evelyn stared out the window, watching the lights blur through the mist. "Residual heat," she murmured, as if tasting the words. "After all these years?" Marcus kept his eyes on the road. "Could be nothing. Maybe just decomposing materials or pressure from groundwater." "Or something else," she said softly. Sleep came fitfully. Evelyn dreamed of standing in the pit again, looking down into the darkness. The metallic door gleamed like a mirror, and when she leaned closer, she saw her reflection bending and shifting. Its mouth opening as though to speak, she woke with a start, her pulse racing, the sound of the pump still echoing in her ears. In the following days, work intensified. Heavy machinery arrived, floodlights turned night into day, and a team of specialists in protective suits took over the site. They installed ventilation ducts and sampling devices around the perimeter. Rumors spread among the workers. Some said it was an old chemical plant, others whispered about secret military experiments. No one really knew. Keating briefed the Johnsons every morning. The structure appeared to extend farther than anticipated, tunnels branching in several directions, though their exact length was uncertain. "It's not random," he told them. "This was designed with purpose. Every measurement aligns perfectly, every joint reinforced. Whoever built it knew exactly what they were doing." Evelyn asked if they had tried to open the hatch. Keating shook his head. "Not yet. The pressure readings fluctuate. We're being cautious. Last thing we want is to trigger a collapse or release something hazardous." Marcus admired his restraint, but also felt frustration building. Part of him needed to know what lay below. It wasn't just curiosity. It was personal. That land had belonged to them. Their lives had been rooted in it. Whatever had been hidden there had shaped their fate. One afternoon, while the Johnsons were in the tent reviewing new findings, a sharp alarm blared from the pit. Keating and his team rushed outside. A section of the lower wall had given way, exposing a new layer of concrete. Through the breach, a faint metallic gleam could be seen, a tunnel or conduit leading away from the central chamber. The workers scrambled to stabilize the edges, shouting instructions over the roar of machinery. Evelyn watched, transfixed. The newly revealed surface bore markings, faded paint, a sequence of numbers, and beneath them, letters barely legible. F3. Keating stared at it, his expression darkening. "That matches something," he muttered. He went to his maps and flipped through them until he found an old blueprint fragment. There, barely visible, was the same notation, F3, beside a dotted line labeled Auxiliary Containment Corridor. What was contained there? Marcus asked. Keating looked up, his eyes wary. That's the problem. The records end right there. Everything beyond that point is missing. By nightfall, the pit had been partially covered with tarps to prevent more rain from seeping in. The air around the site felt charged, alive with tension. Floodlights cast long shadows that stretched across the ground like the arms of something reaching upward. Later, as the Johnsons prepared to leave, Evelyn lingered by the fence. The hum of the pumps seemed deeper tonight, more rhythmic. She thought she heard something else beneath it, a low, almost melodic resonance like air moving through hollow pipes. She glanced at Marcus, but he was already walking toward the car. That sound followed her long after they drove away. In the motel room, she turned on the television. The evening news replayed footage of the sight, the anchor's voice calm but urgent. Authorities confirmed the discovery of a sealed underground structure beneath the evacuated Coal Road district, he said. Officials have not released details, but sources indicate the chamber dates back to the early 20th century. Further excavation is ongoing. Evelyn turned off the sound and watched the images in silence. The camera zoomed in on the crater, on the glint of metal beneath the floodlights. It looked less like a ruin and more like a secret that had waited too long to be unearthed. Marcus came out of the bathroom, drying his hands. "You're still watching that?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes remained fixed on the screen. "They said the letters F3, she whispered. "I saw that before." "Where?" "In the library, years ago. I was sorting through old municipal files, wartime stuff. There was a reference to something called Sector F3. I thought it was just a water project, but it was classified." Marcus frowned. "You think it's connected?" Evelyn nodded slowly. "I'm sure of it." Outside, the rain began again, soft at first, then steady. It drummed against the motel roof like the steady ticking of time itself, each drop marking another moment closer to whatever truth lay buried beneath their old home. And though neither of them said it aloud, they both felt it. The sense that something in the earth had shifted again, something that was no longer content to stay hidden. Beneath the surface, behind the sealed walls and layers of concrete, the ground held its breath, waiting for the next move. By the time the 5th week of excavation began, Coal Road was no longer a neighborhood. It was a zone, sealed off and monitored, patrolled by security vehicles that rolled silently through the early morning fog. The old street sign still stood, rusted and half buried in mud, but no one lived there anymore. The air smelled of diesel and wet earth, and the low hum of machinery was constant, unbroken even through the night. Beneath the bright glare of floodlights, the crater that had swallowed the Johnsons' backyard had transformed into a full-scale archaeological site, though no one quite knew what they were digging for. Marcus and Evelyn had become reluctant figures of interest to the media. Reporters followed them to and from the motel, asking for quotes, for reactions, for emotions they could package into neat sound bites. But the Johnsons had little to offer. Their world, once small and full of simple certainties, had become something incomprehensible. The questions everyone else asked, about ownership, responsibility, danger, meant nothing to them. The only question that mattered now was what had been buried beneath their home, and why. On a cold morning, Keating met them at the site once again. The look on his face told them that something had changed. He was holding a tablet displaying thermal imaging scans. "We've started to get clear readings inside the chamber," he said. "The temperature isn't stable. It fluctuates. At first, we thought it was caused by groundwater, but the pattern repeats at intervals. It's rhythmic." Evelyn felt her chest tighten. "You mean, like something moving?" "Not necessarily movement," Keating said, though he didn't sound convinced. "More like air displacement. The sensors pick up micro-changes in pressure every few hours. It could be an echo effect, or it could be mechanical." "Mechanical?" Marcus repeated. "After 80 years?" Keating lowered the tablet. "That's what we're trying to figure out." The workers had cleared most of the debris around the circular hatch. Now it was fully visible, a vast metal plate coated with corrosion and streaked with greenish mineral deposits. Around its rim were faded markings, numbers, symbols, and letters that no one could yet decipher. Keating's team had identified the alloy as an unusual mix of iron and nickel, resistant to conventional decay. It was designed to last, he said. Whatever is inside was meant to stay sealed. At midday, the pumps were turned off, and the site fell briefly silent. The sound of water draining stopped, replaced by the faint whistling of wind through the equipment. It was then that Evelyn noticed something strange, a faint, low hum rising from beneath the hatch. It was barely audible, a vibration more felt than heard, like the purring of an immense buried engine. She froze, her breath catching. "Marcus," she whispered, "do you hear that?" He tilted his head, listening. The sound was there, unmistakable, a subtle resonance that seemed to pulse through the air. When he looked at Keating, the engineer's expression was unreadable. "We've detected that before," he admitted quietly. "It comes and goes. Sometimes we think it's the machinery, but when we shut everything down, it keeps going. We're monitoring it." "What if it's coming from inside?" Evelyn asked. Keating didn't answer. Over the next few days, the operation intensified. More specialists arrived, their vehicles marked with insignias from agencies the Johnsons didn't recognize. The mood around the site shifted. Less curiosity, more control. Fences were reinforced, guards posted at every entrance. The press was pushed farther back. The Johnsons noticed that some workers stopped talking when they approached. Keating tried to maintain his usual composure, but his voice had lost its calm rhythm. Something beneath that hatch was unsettling everyone, even those trained not to show it. Evelyn spent hours watching from behind the safety barrier. The metal glinted beneath the floodlights, its surface slick from constant mist. Each evening, when the workers left, condensation gathered on the hatch, and the air above it shimmered faintly with heat. She began keeping a notebook, recording the sounds she heard, the times when the vibrations returned, the small shifts in temperature that made the ground feel alive. Her notes were meticulous, but they did nothing to ease her unease. One evening, as they prepared to leave, Keating approached them with a weary expression. "We're opening it tomorrow," he said. "We've run every test we can. Pressure levels are stable enough to proceed." Evelyn's pulse quickened. "You're really going to open it?" Keating nodded. "We have to. The structural integrity of the chamber is deteriorating. If we don't intervene, it could collapse. And if there's hazardous material inside, we need to contain it before that happens." Marcus's voice was low. "And if it's not hazardous?" Keating hesitated. "Then it's history." That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. Rain lashed against the motel window, and the neon sign outside flickered in the dark. She sat up in bed, her notebook open on her lap, reading over her notes by the dim bedside lamp. The times, the sounds, the patterns, all of it seemed to form a rhythm, like breathing. She thought again of the markings on the hatch, the numbers worn down by time. The symbols reminded her of something she'd seen once, years ago, in a dusty folder at the library. A declassified wartime memo referencing containment vaults for materials deemed unstable or strategically sensitive. She had dismissed it then as bureaucratic language. Now it felt like prophecy. Marcus stirred beside her. "You're still awake," he murmured. She closed the notebook. "They're opening it in the morning." "I know." He sat up, rubbing his eyes. "I can't stop thinking about it. Whatever's down there, it's been hidden for a reason." Maybe the reason's gone, she said softly. Maybe it's time for it to be found. He turned toward her, his expression somber. Or maybe it's time for it to stay buried. At dawn, the rain had stopped. The site buzzed with activity. Workers moved like figures in a carefully rehearsed ritual, each step deliberate. The Johnsons stood with Keating at the edge, watching as the team assembled the rig designed to lift the hatch. Thick steel cables were attached to its perimeter, connected to a crane that loomed above the pit like a giant sentinel. Every motion was accompanied by the shrill whine of hydraulics and the bark of radio commands. Evelyn gripped the railing. Her palms were slick with sweat despite the cold. The hum beneath the earth had grown stronger that morning, vibrating through the soles of her shoes. Even the air seemed denser, heavier, filled with an invisible weight. Keating raised his hand, signaling the crew. The crane engine roared to life and the cables tightened. The sound of metal groaning echoed through the pit as the hatch resisted, clinging stubbornly to the earth that had held it for nearly a century. For a moment, Evelyn thought it would never move. Then came a sharp crack, a fracture splitting through the concrete rim, and the hatch began to rise, inch by inch, dragging with it a long, guttural moan that reverberated through the ground. The smell hit them first, not rot or decay, but something metallic, ancient, like the air inside a sealed vault suddenly freed. Steam hissed from the edges as cold air met something warmer below. Workers stepped back, shouting over the noise. The crane continued to lift until the hatch tilted slightly, revealing a black void beneath it. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. For a moment, no one spoke. The floodlights turned the opening into a well of shadow, deep and impenetrable. Then a gust of air rushed upward, carrying with it a low sound, an almost melodic hum that seemed to vibrate inside their bones. Evelyn stumbled back, clutching Marcus's arm. "What is that?" she whispered. Keating's voice was hoarse. "We don't know." The workers set up sensors along the edge, lowering instruments into the darkness. The readings came back erratic. Pressure spikes, electromagnetic fluctuations, heat differentials. Nothing consistent. Nothing they could explain. "It's self-contained," one of the technicians said, their structure below, multiple levels. As they watched, faint light flickered deep inside the pit. At first, Evelyn thought it was a reflection from the floodlights, but then it pulsed again, steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. "Tell me that's the equipment," Marcus said, but no one answered him. Keating ordered the team to halt operations for the night. The hatch, now resting beside the crater, loomed like the lid of a tomb. The air that rose from the opening carried a strange humidity, warm against the skin. Evelyn shivered. That evening, back at the motel, she couldn't shake the image of that pulsing light. It lingered in her mind, red and faint, like something calling from deep below. She turned on the television, hoping for distraction, but every channel carried the same story. Footage of the opening, the speculation, the panic. Some said it was a forgotten bunker, others a lost mine. Conspiracy theorists flooded the airwaves. The truth was simpler and far more terrifying. They had no idea what they had uncovered. In the following days, the site was locked down completely. The Johnsons were no longer allowed near it. Keating called once, his voice curt and cautious. "I can't say much," he told them, "but we found corridors, steel-lined, and doors, plural." "Doors to what?" Marcus asked. Keating hesitated. "To something built for containment. Not storage, containment. There's a difference." Then the line went dead. After that, no one returned their calls. At night, Evelyn dreamed of the hatch again. In her dreams, the pit was wider, endless, and she stood at its edge watching the red light glow brighter. When she looked down, she saw not reflection, but movement, slow, deliberate, like shadows shifting beneath water. And just before waking, she always heard the same sound, the deep hum rising, swelling, until it became a single note that filled the world. When she woke, she would find Marcus sitting by the window, staring toward the direction of Cole Road, as if listening for something. The city outside was still and quiet, but in the distance, faint and rhythmic, came the low, steady pulse of machines, or perhaps something older, something alive beneath the earth, awakening after a very long sleep. And though neither of them spoke it aloud, they both knew that opening the hatch had not been the end of the story. It had been the beginning. For several days after the opening of the hatch, Cole Road became a place out of time, a corridor between the past and the present, where men in protective suits descended into a hole that breathed like a living thing. The official statements were vague and contradictory. City representatives spoke of an underground containment structure of historical significance, but refused to elaborate on what it contained. Rumors spread faster than facts ever could. Whispers of chemical weapons, buried archives, experimental technology, even mass graves. Each version found its believers. Yet, for Marcus and Evelyn, who had lived above that buried mystery for most of their lives, the uncertainty was worse than any of the theories. They had seen the faint light below the surface with their own eyes. They had heard the hum that no one could explain. The motel had become their world. The curtains stayed drawn most of the time. Evelyn would sit on the edge of the bed with her notebook open, trying to make sense of the fragments of information leaking through news reports and the messages left on Keating's voicemail that were never returned. Marcus spent his hours pacing, unable to rest, his thoughts circling endlessly around the same question. Why had the ground opened now, after all these decades of silence? He told himself it was erosion, time, chance. But part of him didn't believe that. Some nights he swore he felt faint tremors, as if something beneath the surface was shifting again. On the seventh night, there was a knock at the door. Evelyn rose, startled. Marcus peered through the peephole and saw Keating standing in the rain, his orange vest gone, his expression drawn and haunted. Marcus opened the door. "You shouldn't be here," Keating said immediately, glancing down the corridor. "They don't want anyone talking to you, especially not now." "What did you find?" Marcus demanded. Keating hesitated, then stepped inside, dripping water onto the carpet. "You didn't hear this from me," he said quietly. "The chamber goes deeper than we thought. Much deeper. It's not just a single vault, it's a network of connected corridors, concrete and steel, all built to military specifications. We found access points branching off the main shaft, each sealed by reinforced doors. The design is identical to Cold War bunkers, but older, predating that era by at least a decade." Evelyn's voice trembled. "How far down?" Keating rubbed his temples. "Over 60 meters, and it keeps going. The lowest scanners haven't even reached the bottom. The architecture is organized, deliberate. It's not a mine, not a storage site, it's something else. Some of the walls still have power conduits, and there are markings, letters, numbers. F3 appears everywhere." She exchanged a glance with Marcus. "Sector F3, she whispered. Keating's eyes flickered. "You know that name?" Evelyn explained what she remembered from the library, the wartime files, the references to restricted projects. Keaton nodded grimly. We cross-referenced that designation. It was tied to a federal contract during the early 1940s, officially listed as an underground hydrological research program. But the archives stop there. Nothing beyond a few pages survives. Whatever it was erased deliberately. And now it's under your property. Marcus leaned forward. What are they going to do? They're sending a federal team. They'll take control of the site, classify everything. My team's being dismissed. They said our work is done. He paused, then added in a whisper, they found rooms down there. Empty rooms, perfectly preserved. And something else, a chamber with an inner wall of glass. The engineers said it looked like a containment tank, but whatever it held, it's gone. A chill passed through the room. Rain drummed against the windows. Evelyn felt her pulse quicken. Gone? She repeated. Keating nodded. The seals were fractured from the inside. The glass was shattered outward. We don't know when. It could have been decades ago, but the sensors show traces of heat in the air. Faint but consistent, like a residual energy source still lingering. Marcus stared at him, speechless. You think something was alive down there? Keaton didn't answer directly. I think someone built that place to keep something from ever reaching the surface, and now it's open. Before they could ask more, a car engine sounded outside. Keating turned sharply toward the window. I have to go, he said. If they find me here, just stay out of it, both of you. Whatever happens next isn't meant for the public. He opened the door, stepped into the rain, and was gone before they could stop him. That night, neither of them slept. Evelyn sat up watching the rain streak down the glass while Marcus stared at the blank wall, lost in thought. By morning, Keating's warning had proven true. The site was now surrounded by military vehicles, and a temporary command center had been erected where their house once stood. Soldiers patrolled the area in silence, their faces hidden behind visors. No one answered questions. The news channels ran footage of covered trucks leaving the zone at night. Officials repeated the same statement. Containment procedures are ongoing. Days turned into weeks. The hum beneath the city grew fainter, but Evelyn could still feel it. A deep vibration that seemed to come not from the ground but from the air itself. It followed her into her dreams. In them, she saw endless corridors stretching beneath the city, lit by flickering lamps that hummed with unseen current. She would walk through them, calling Marcus's name, until she reached a vast circular chamber where the air shimmered like water. Then she would wake, trembling, her heart pounding, the image still burning in her mind. Marcus tried to rationalize it all. Maybe the chamber vented gas when they opened it, he said. It could make people hear things, feel things, like when miners get disoriented underground. But even as he spoke, he sounded unconvinced. He had seen the light in the pit, the slow pulse like a heartbeat. No gas could do that. One evening, unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, Marcus drove toward Cole Road. The streets were deserted, the barricades sealed. He parked near the last checkpoint and sat there, engine off, watching the floodlights in the distance. The air trembled faintly, the hum returning like a song at the edge of hearing. For a moment, he imagined he saw movement near the crater, a flicker of light, red and rhythmic, deep below. Then it vanished. When he returned to the motel, Evelyn was waiting, her eyes wide. You went there, didn't you? He nodded slowly. It's still glowing. She didn't ask what he meant. Some things no longer needed explaining. The next morning, loud knocking jolted them awake. Two men in suits stood outside, their expressions blank. They showed identification, but no agency name. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, one of them said evenly, "You'll need to come with us. We have some questions about your property and your interactions with site personnel." They were escorted to a windowless room inside a government facility on the outskirts of the city. The air smelled of disinfectant and metal. A single light buzzed overhead. The questioning lasted hours. Dates, names, what they'd seen, what Keating had told them. Every answer was written down, but never acknowledged. When Evelyn finally asked what was happening beneath their home, the man across the table merely replied, "The situation is contained." Contained. The word echoed in her mind long after they were released. Back at the motel, exhaustion replaced fear. They said little for the rest of the day, but that night, as Evelyn sat at the window, she saw a glow on the horizon where Cole Road lay hidden. It wasn't the steady white of floodlights. It was softer, redder, pulsing faintly in the mist. She called Marcus to look, but by the time he joined her, the glow was gone. The following morning, the television channels were silent on the subject. Instead, they played unrelated news, weather, sports, politics. It was as if the sinkhole had never existed. Only one brief article appeared online, buried deep in local archives, noting that the Cole Road containment site has been stabilized and sealed. No mention of the structure or of the network beneath. But that night, a faint vibration rattled the motel's floor. Marcus sat up in bed, listening. It came in slow intervals, like the echo of distant machinery, or breathing. Evelyn opened her eyes. "It's still there," she whispered. He nodded. "It'll always be there." In the weeks that followed, the Johnsons tried to rebuild their lives. The city offered them compensation, a new home in another district, but they refused. Nothing could replace what had been lost. They rented a small house on the edge of town, surrounded by fields where the air felt still and untroubled. Yet, even there, sometimes late at night, Evelyn would wake and feel the bed tremble softly beneath her, a subtle rhythm that reminded her of the hum she had once felt in her garden. She began writing down everything she remembered, the timelines, the conversations, even her dreams. Marcus thought it was pointless, but she said it helped her stay sane. "If I don't write it," she told him, "it'll fade, and I'll start to think we imagined it." One afternoon, she returned to the library drawn by a need she couldn't explain. She searched through the archives again, through the dusty boxes of wartime documents that no one had touched in years. And there, tucked between two folders, she found a map, hand-drawn, yellowed with age. It showed the old mining district, the same one where Cole Road now stood. Beneath it, faintly inked, were lines forming a pattern, a network of chambers labeled F1 through F5. The deepest of them, F3, was circled in red ink. Next to it, in small, fading handwriting, someone had written a single word: breach. She took the map home and laid it on the table before Marcus. He studied it in silence, then looked up at her. "It wasn't an accident," he said finally. "It was coming undone all along." That night, the sky was clear for the first time in weeks. The stars hung bright above the dark silhouette of the hills. Evelyn stood outside, listening to the quiet. But underneath the chirping of crickets and the soft rustle of wind through grass, she could still sense it, the faint hum, distant but steady, like a memory the earth itself refused to forget. Somewhere below, beneath layers of soil and stone, the city beneath the city continued to exist, sealed again, but never silent. The ground had its own kind of memory, she thought. It remembered what people tried to bury. And someday, when enough time passed, it would remember again. It was almost 3 months before the city finally announced that the Coal Road district had been stabilized. The broadcasts were brief, perfunctory, delivered in the dry cadence of bureaucratic relief. Ground reinforcements complete, hazard zones neutralized, residential restoration underway. The words were meant to reassure, but for those who had lived through it, reassurance had become meaningless. What could stability possibly mean after the ground itself had proven untrustworthy? Marcus and Evelyn listened to the statement on a small kitchen radio in their rented house at the edge of town. The announcer's voice crackled and faded, leaving behind a static hum that reminded them of something they had both tried to forget. Evelyn reached over and switched it off. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The morning light spilled through the window, soft and pale. Outside, the wind moved lazily through the tall grass. Marcus stared at his hands, roughened by months of nervous work, repairs, small projects, anything to fill the time. "They want us to come back," he said quietly. "They've sent a letter. They're calling it a reoccupation phase." Evelyn looked at him, her face unreadable. "Do you want to?" He hesitated. "It's still our home." "Is it?" she asked softly. The word home sounded foreign to her now, fragile and uncertain. But deep down, she knew they would go. They had to. There was no real peace in distance, only a different kind of silence. 2 days later, they drove toward the district. The road that once bustled with life was eerily empty. The houses that had survived stood stripped and pale like ghosts of themselves. The fences were gone, the trees cut back. The air had a strange sterility, heavy with the scent of fresh cement and chemical sealants. At the end of the street, their house waited. Rebuilt, repainted, identical in structure yet completely changed. It looked like a photograph that had been retouched to hide the flaws but could not hide the absence of life behind it. When they stepped out of the car, Evelyn felt the faint crunch of gravel under her shoes. The new lawn was freshly laid sod, its edges unnaturally sharp. A uniformed official stood by the gate, clipboard in hand. He greeted them politely and handed Marcus a packet of papers. "The property's been cleared for reoccupation," he said. "You'll find the reinforcements well in place. There's a monitoring system embedded beneath the foundation. Sensors, geotextiles, pressure grids. You shouldn't have any further problems." Marcus thanked him, though the words felt hollow. As the man left, Evelyn looked toward the backyard. The fence was new, the garden gone. In its place stretched a flat expanse of soil, recently leveled and still damp from rain. Near the center, a square of concrete marked the site of the sinkhole, a patch of engineered perfection covering what once had been a wound. They entered the house in silence. The air smelled faintly of paint and varnish. Every surface gleamed with the impersonality of reconstruction. Yet, in the corners of each room, Evelyn could still sense the faint echoes of their former life, the ghostly outlines of furniture, the faded memories of where things used to be. She paused in the living room, touching the wall where a picture once hung. The plaster was smooth, cool, unblemished, as if it had never cracked, but beneath that perfection, she could still feel it, the faint vibration, distant and slow, like a memory stored in the bones of the house itself. That night, they lay in the rebuilt bedroom. Marcus slept uneasily, his breathing shallow. Evelyn lay awake, listening. The air was utterly still, but she could hear the faintest sound, a low thrum barely perceptible, a whisper through the concrete. It came in slow intervals, as if the earth were exhaling. She sat up and held her breath. The sound faded, then returned. She looked toward the window, but outside the world was calm, the moon hanging pale over the scarred street. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "It's still there." In the morning, she didn't mention it. Marcus brewed coffee, checked the utilities, busied himself with the reassuring banalities of normal life. The day passed quietly. The neighbors, or what few remained, came by to greet them. They spoke of reconstruction grants, new safety measures, the future. No one mentioned the word sinkhole. The city had effectively erased it from its vocabulary, as if naming it might make it return. That afternoon, Marcus stood at the edge of the backyard, staring at the concrete slab that covered what had once been the pit. It was seamless, polished, and faintly reflective, the light glinting off its surface like a frozen pond. He crouched down and touched it. It was cool to the touch, but not cold. The sensation was strange. There was no vibration, no warmth, and yet something about it felt alive, as though it held its own faint pulse. He straightened, uneasy. "They said it's stable," he muttered, though no one was there to hear him. Inside the house, Evelyn unpacked the last of their belongings. She found her old notebook among the boxes, the one she had filled with observations during those long weeks at the motel, the times, the sounds, the dreams. She opened it and traced the ink with her fingers. The pages were warped, the handwriting uneven. On the final page, written in her own script but as though by another hand, were the words, "It's breathing again." She couldn't remember writing them. That evening, as the sun slipped below the rooftops, Marcus built a small fire in the yard. They sat together in the fading light, listening to the crackle of wood. It almost felt normal, almost peaceful. Evelyn leaned her head on his shoulder. "Do you think it's over?" she asked. He hesitated. "I think it's buried." She smiled faintly. "Buried doesn't mean gone." He didn't answer. The silence between them was long and comfortable, yet beneath it lay the same unspoken awareness that some things could not be sealed away forever. When they went inside, Marcus turned off the lights and paused by the window. The yard was bathed in the silver glow of the moon. For a moment, he thought he saw a shimmer ripple across the concrete, like a faint distortion in the air. It vanished as quickly as it came. He told himself it was the wind. They settled into their new routine. Days passed without incident. Evelyn returned to her work at the library, and Marcus took a job repairing electrical systems for the reconstruction teams. Life resumed its quiet rhythm, but sometimes when the nights were particularly still, they would both wake at the same moment, though neither would say why. Each would listen to the silence, to the faint feeling that the ground beneath them was not as silent as it seemed. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the city archives. Evelyn had written months earlier requesting access to files related to Sector F3. She had almost forgotten about it. The letter was brief, signed by a department official whose name she didn't recognize. It stated that no such records existed and advised her to cease inquiries into restricted historical infrastructure. But tucked at the bottom of the envelope was a photocopy of something, an old inspection note handwritten in pencil. The date was 1952. The note read, "Containment breach minimal. Primary seal reinforced. Subject inert. Monitoring to continue indefinitely." Evelyn stared at it for a long time, her hands trembling. The word inert seemed to echo in her mind. What had they sealed? And was it truly inert or merely sleeping? She folded the paper and hid it in the notebook, saying nothing to Marcus. Some truths, she decided, were safer kept in the dark. Weeks turned into months. The world moved on, the headlines shifted, and the sinkhole became a footnote in city history. Yet the Johnsons remained quietly changed. Their lives were smaller now, their joys more cautious. They no longer trusted stillness. Sometimes Evelyn would stand by the window at dawn, watching the fog lift over the quiet street, and feel that same tremor in the air, a barely perceptible pulse, the echo of something vast and unseen. One evening in late autumn, Marcus was in the garage repairing a loose circuit. He switched off the light to test the wiring and froze. The room was dark, but through the floor he felt it again, a faint vibration, deep and steady. It was the same rhythm he had felt months ago, the same invisible pulse that had haunted their nights. He crouched, pressing his palm against the concrete. The vibration continued, slow and deliberate, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. For a long time he stayed that way, his breath shallow until it faded once more. When he came inside, Evelyn was sitting at the table, her notebook open, staring at the final page. She didn't look up. "You felt it too," she said. He nodded. "It's weaker than before." "For now," she replied. They sat together in silence as the night deepened around them. Outside, the wind stirred the branches, and the shadows of the trees stretched long across the lawn. The city slept, unaware of the quiet secret buried beneath its foundations. Near midnight, Marcus rose and went to the backyard. The moonlight poured over the concrete slab, silver and cold. He stood there, listening. The hum was gone now, replaced by the faint rustle of leaves. Yet, as he turned to go back inside, a soft sound stopped him. A faint clicking from beneath the slab, mechanical and distant, like a machine winding down after a long rest. It lasted only a second, then silence returned. He didn't tell Evelyn about it. He knew she already suspected. Some things were better left unnamed. In the days that followed, they continued their quiet life. The house stood firm, the sensors in the basement silent. To anyone else, it was an ordinary home, but for Marcus and Evelyn, it would never be ordinary again. They lived with the knowledge that beneath them, the city had a second heart, a vast, forgotten network that once pulsed with human intent and perhaps something beyond it. Sometimes at dusk, as the light faded and the first stars appeared, Evelyn would stand on the porch and listen to the stillness. "It's peaceful now," Marcus would say, joining her. She would nod, but her eyes would stay on the ground. "Peaceful," she would echo, her voice barely above a whisper. "For now." And deep below, under the reinforced slab and the layers of gravel and steel, the old tunnels of Sector F3 slept again. The air was heavy, motionless, sealed behind concrete and time. Yet, in the depths of that silence where light had not touched for generations, something faint and slow continued to stir, an echo, a breath, a memory of motion. It was not alive, not exactly, but neither was it dead. It was simply waiting. Above it, the house stood quiet in the moonlight, a small island of human will built over a secret that no one dared to name. The city around it hummed with its endless, ordinary life, cars, lights, voices, laughter, unaware that beneath its streets, beneath the ordinary hum of existence, the earth still remembered. And in that memory, in that deep and ancient pulse, the story of the Johnsons and their house on Cole Road would forever remain. A faint vibration in the heart of the world, patient and eternal. Don't miss what happens next. Hit subscribe and stay with us for more shocking real stories and mysteries just like this one. Turn on notifications so you're the first to see when the next chapter drops, and share this video with your friends. Let them know what's been uncovered beneath the surface.